Hey everybody, can you hear me? Is that okay? Don't mind me if I'm looking up here, down here. I don't have these all memorized. So I'm Shaun Londahl. I'm the president of KRS. I've been there almost 20 years now. Our company's been around a lot longer than that. And this is Seth. He's the creative director. He'll introduce himself in a little more detail throughout the presentation. So we were asked to come talk about the importance of branding in C-stores. Today we're gonna cover a little bit about King Retail, KRS, because most of you probably have never heard of us. Sorry, one second. We're also going to talk a little bit about the current market landscape. We work with companies all over North America, all over the world, so we have some insight into that. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of branding and what branding really means, the process of a rebrand, and then Seth will run you through some case studies from our recent experience. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about ways we might think about specific tailored strategies for tribal convenience stores. So a little bit about us. So King Retail, we're based in Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, but we do work all over North America, primarily some design work internationally. We really offer kind of these core services to our customers. Retail design, we do interior and exterior retail design. We do production of specialty fixtures and case goods and signage and decor. We can help with installation of those materials. We can also do commercial kitchen design and equipment specification, and then site survey work as well. So our manufacturing, we have about 100,000 square feet of manufacturing there in Eugene, where we do all sorts of different cool production. We have a full wood shop, do case goods manufacturing, a metal shop where we do wire bending and sheet metal cutting and all kinds of cool stuff. It's like whenever my oldest son, who's now 13, has a school project, I'm just like, come on down. We have all the machines to build all the cool projects that he needs. And then we distribute from there, again, all over North America. The kinds of companies we work with, all sorts of retailers, so not just convenience stores, although that's a big segment for us. We also work with many grocery chains. We work with hotels, with restaurants. So really, when we come into thinking about the design for a convenience store space and how to engage with the customers in that space through your brand, we're really taking learnings from all sorts of different retailers. I think that's really important because, as you all know, convenience store industry is changing like crazy. They're getting bigger. In some cases, they're getting smaller. Really, the cross-pollination between what a grocery store used to be and what a C-store is now, really those lines are blurring even more and more and more every day. Then you add make-to-order food, and really they're becoming full restaurants in some cases. So really, a C-store is a mini grocery store in some cases, it's a restaurant in some cases, and so having the ability to really take learnings that we have from different industries and bring them to the C-store space really helps us in our design projects. And just in terms of scale, so last year we worked in about 20 million square feet of retail space, whether that was through design, through our construction and manufacturing services, and through our installation. So we work with a lot of retailers. But we also do a lot of single store projects as well, all the way up through big rollouts. All right, that's enough about us. So the current landscape. A lot of this you probably already know, but I just want to highlight on a couple things. So one interesting fact from last year is that even though there are all these big conglomerates that are buying up convenience stores around the United States and Canada, the Couche-Tards, the 7-Elevens with thousands of locations. What was interesting is last year, there were over 1,000 brand new to market single store operators that came into the C-store business in the United States. And that single store operator makes up 60% of all C-stores in the US. So they are these massive players. And then there's also just a ton of competition at the single store operator level. So you're getting competition from really big brands and a ton of really interesting niche single store operators. Not to mention the competition that you have from fast food chains, from restaurants, from grocery stores. So there's just tons of competition. So one of the important facts about branding is it's a way to really tell your story to your customer so that you can drive more traffic, maintain those customers that are coming in, have them come back in over and over again so that your sales go up. Some of the themes that we're hearing about actually were represented earlier today. So when we're talking to all these different chains, we're hearing trends like EV, obviously, that's coming in some way. So how does that get addressed in your stores or theme? So when we think about branding, we want to consider how do all those different touch points from where you're filling up or where you're plugging in to the loyalty program, how do we build congruency between all of those touch points and the actual shopping experience in your stores? So again, some more stats. So we have across the U.S., all these brand new single store operators, and then what we see obviously with the tribal C stores is there's 570 stores right now and growing. Huge amount of them are in the Northeast and on the West Coast, so there's just tons of growth there too. All right, so the importance of branding. So again, a brand is not just a logo or a brand mark. It's really the mark that you leave on your shopper. So when somebody comes in and experiences your brand, it's not just the color palette, it's not just the logo, it's how your employees engage with them and treat them. That's just as much about brand as the design of the store. So when Seth goes through and thinks about a design project, the first step is we really want to understand what's your brand story. And if you can't tell us what that is, we want to help you come up with that and write that down and understand what's the story you want to tell your customers to differentiate from the competition. And I'll let Seth jump in now.
Forgive me as I check the mic distance here. Yeah, Shaun mentioned branding is important, but I think it's also important to know what branding is, right? So I think if I were to have asked the room, what is branding? If you came to someone and you want your brand development done, most people would say, oh, it's a logo, right? We need a logo designed, and oh, it may entail picking colors, or maybe even materials that go in the store. But as he alluded, it's much more than that. So you're looking to basically define yourself and your brand and how your customers perceive your company. That's really what branding is. And things that branding does, obviously, it enhances your customer's experience and therefore, hopefully, your customer loyalty as well. So what does that mean? So one thing branding can do is it helps you define and differentiate, right? So when you look at competitors in your market, you want to basically establish something that your customers are going to remember. And also you want to make sure your brand is appropriate for that target customer. So that does include a logo. It does include color palette and material. So what we often do with companies that are looking to establish either a new brand or to rebrand an existing company, we go through something we call art direction. But essentially it's kind of painting a vision of what, in this case, Rocket's Convenience Plus could have become. And as you see in the top corner there, we explore multiple different directions and work with the customer to decide what's appropriate for your target audience. In this case, we had some fun. We explored one that was a little bit more retro, kind of a kickback to the space race era, the 50s and 60s, and then one that was very, almost like a science fiction movie, very clean with sleek materials, lots of metal. But what we found that really neither one of those fit the target audience in his region. So we ended up with something that was very clean and contemporary, but still had various elements throughout the store that tied back into the naming Rockets. So this example is quite different. You know, immediately visually you can tell, wow, that brand is very different than the Rockets brand. What's interesting about that is it was a very similar store that we were designing, but very different target audience, and therefore a very different approach that we took with the naming of the space, the branding of the logo. So in this case, the market was actually a part of a larger resort. It was very upscale, 5-star restaurants, so very nice materials, very elegant design. So we needed a brand that basically supported that same image and also reached that same customer base. So again, Very similar process of going through art direction and material boards, but ultimately landing on a very different brand than the previous project showed. One other thing that often gets overlooked when you're thinking about how your customers perceive your brand and your store, usually you kind of think of the visual image as brand, but you don't often think of how the store is actually laid out and designed. But we find that that's just as important, if not more important sometimes, than what's on the actual walls themselves. So how store layout can affect brand, anything from even just simple things like planning out your sight lines, planning out obviously the placement of departments and product throughout your store, but also thinking about it as you are the customer. So we often go through customer journeys. We think about how a shopper might experience your store in the morning, how they might experience it later at night, maybe after work, stopping on their way home. But all the equipment selection, the placement of those equipment, even down to the hierarchy of the signage within your store and branded environment is just as important as the materials and colors in those signs. So when we're designing with clients, we often spend a lot of time and a lot of thought goes into the actual store planning and layout of a space as well. One thing I also like to mention is the equipment selection is very important. So even just the simple, the interfaces on the machines that you're buying, making sure that that's easy for your customer to use, like the one-touch coffee machines that we're seeing hit the market. Even the type of case that you use, whether it requires someone to open a door versus is it just a reach-in open-air cooler. All of those decisions play into how your customers perceive your brand and therefore their overall customer experience. And then this one obviously is a little more obvious, but how does that brand translate into the environment is really important. So when we think of how a customer experiences your logo, your company, and your brand, sometimes it actually even starts before they arrive on property. So especially with the more and more that we're seeing loyalty apps and mobile phone apps and programs, a customer is seeing your logo before they even arrive at the fuel pumps. And then also they're seeing your exterior of your building before they ever enter the store. So as we're thinking about branding and how that can make a customer's experience a good one or a bad one, we try to make sure all of those elements work in harmony, right? So making sure that your colors are right, your logos are shown, but even down to the level of detail in the actual signage in the space, whether that's giving sub-brands or sub-naming to certain areas within the store, that all reinforces that customer's perception of your brand and your company. So in this case, you can see is, the materials in the exterior, interior, they all match and reinforce each other, even down to some of the sub-branding, like their coffee naming, the fountain soda area, as well as their kitchen area, which was called Rockets Cafe. So that's a little bit about what branding is, and some of that was obvious. Maybe some of it was a little different than maybe how you thought of branding before. But here's the real question is like, well, how do we go about a rebrand? So what is the process of rebranding our stores? So we'll take you through a couple examples, and then I'll speak to a few steps in a couple of case studies as well. But one thing that obviously is important if you're going to make sure your brand is appropriate is you have to do your homework. So one of the first things we like to do is what we call a discovery or a research phase. Most design firms probably have something very similar. So whether it's a brand refresh or creating a new brand from the scratch, whether you're working on new construction or a renovation project, you all kind of go through the same steps, no matter the case. So I mentioned the discovery. Usually what we do, it's kind of a mix of a few things, but often we travel to the site if that's possible. If it's a new construction, obviously we don't do that. But we often do Matterport scans, site surveys, so that we can virtually walk a space, and then we can also pass that information to our entire design team. And then also we do brainstorming. So we often do surveys to really get underneath target audience, the logistics of your store, what products you want to sell. All of those questions affect all of the previous steps that we showed in branding. And then it really boils down to about 6 steps. So like I've harped on, obviously logo and developing a brand itself is kind of the first step. So that's obviously important. So even down to like the fonts that you're choosing in your logo can kind of lead your customer to understand what your stores are going to sell and what that environment might be like. And then we also do art direction, like I mentioned, which really translates how that brand is going to be incorporated into a built environment or an interior of your stores. And then store planning, as I mentioned, is very important, not only logistically how your store shops, but how it feels to the customers that are in those spaces. And then most obviously the interior and exterior design. So what materials you're using, what graphics you're putting into place, what signage is in your store environment, et cetera. And then one that might be the most overlooked is the lighting design in those spaces. So that's also a service we often provide to our clients. But making sure that your store is not only well lit and it looks safe, especially at night hours, but just elevating certain parts of the store or drawing attention to certain parts of the store can really, really affect how your store environment shops. And then lastly up here is drafted plans or detailing a project. So any project that we work on, whether it's a one store prototype or it's meant to be implemented into a large rollout with hundreds of locations, we often detail all of the design and branding literally down to a T. So providing color codes and material choices to really drive consistency. What we've found, especially in C-store chains, our big rollouts, is driving that customer loyalty comes from consistency. So you might have a customer that actually shops multiple stores if they're in, a similar 5-mile radius. So having a consistent experience in each of those stores drives that customer loyalty. And making sure that your signage and your graphics and all the materials and your environment feels similar to those shoppers really, really can help in driving that loyalty. So I'll give you a quick look at a few examples that we've personally worked on in the last few years. This first one was the one that I used in the example of the logo design. It's called The Market at Nemacolin. So this one is in rural Pennsylvania, just north of West Virginia. And you can see right off the bat, the interior design was really elevated to make it feel sophisticated and very refined and curated. Even down to the level of products that they sold, they had really, really high-end food offerings. So the space needed to reinforce that message to the customer. One other thing you'll notice is fun with color and material, things like adding brass light fixtures and brass text and dimensional lettering on the wall. One other thing that you'll notice is there's a lack of graphics. That was very intentional. There's not a lot of icons, not a lot of graphic elements that you might normally see in printed signs, again, to really drive that sophistication. Then a couple final views of the store here. And you can see just fun little design details that really drive that level of feeling that the store is very curated for the shoppers. And then the second example is quite different, right? Extra Mile is probably a brand that most of you are somewhat familiar with. They have a lot of West Coast stores. So we were tasked with designing for them. We did a lot for them, actually, branding, development, interior and exterior design, including their lighting. We did some of their equipment planning, but a majority of what we did with them was a large rollout. So they've been converting stores for a couple years now. And again, we did all the program management for that large rollout. So a couple views here, we'll kind of show a before and after so you get a sense of our design renderings versus the final store. One thing that I like to point out here is because we knew it was a large rollout, one of the things that was really important when developing branding was some sense of modularity, because it was going to go into so many different store layouts, some being very small footprints, some being quite large. So being wise and intentional about the signage and the branding elements to make sure that they're easily adapted up and down is really, really important as well. So this canopy, for instance, it could be used in a series of 3 or 5 or 7, depending on how large the cash wrap area was, and it made that very easy. And then the other thing I'll point out there is the core values that you see right behind the pay point. So one of the last things the customer sees at an Extra Mile is their promise, their customer promise. So again, they really harped on having clean bathrooms and being there for their customer. So reinforcing that with branding and messaging was really important. take a look at their food and beverage area. One thing that we spent a lot of time developing is their actual private label coffee offering, which ended up being called Mile One. So again, reinforcing that it's an extra mile. The naming even itself was important. So we did all the work here that you see, the logos, the colors, all of the graphics, even the illustrations that you see down to the level of the details in each flavor offering, all reinforce the parent brand and therefore feels very cohesive to the shopper. And then just a few other areas. I mentioned earlier, lighting is really important. So in their fizz area, which is their drink offering, adding some fun lighting and some movement in the graphics to really draw that customer to that area. Again, very intentionally done. And then one other area we like to talk about is their recharge area. So it's basically an open air cooler. In some stores, it has multiple pieces of equipment. But the goal was to add a better for you food offering to their customer, but really drive sales as well. So one thing we did was we designed this sign, the recharge sign that you see hanging above, to have some motion and life to it. So it actually has LEDs that track from left to right, almost as if you were seeing like a charge in a battery, like on your phone. But we've actually heard firsthand from customers that caught their attention from the fuel pump, and that got them into the store. So just very intentional things like that, thinking about your customer journey, can really drive sales and improve some of your foot traffic. Another example, this one's kind of Midwest. They have a lot of stores in Idaho, Wyoming, I think maybe even into Colorado now. But it's the Good To Go brand. So we help them with interior and exterior design as well as store layout and then lighting as well. So they had a nice color palette. It's very simple, 2 primary colors. They had a logo that they came to us with, so we kind of built upon an existing brand in this case. But we were tasked with keeping things kind of simple and straightforward, but also adding a little bit of visual interest. So when their stores, when they came to us, their stores were very plain, I would say, to put it politely. But they were really clean, really nicely done. They just didn't have a lot of life to them. So what we did, just subtle things like adding messaging in a script font and adding a second color and then adding icons to each department just to give those food offerings a little bit of life, kind of elevated their brand experience. And then one area that we really were tasked with kind of increasing sales or traffic to was their fountain drink offering. So one way we did that is we add some fun lighting elements to it. So it's a little subtle. Maybe some people pick up on it, maybe people don't. But it was very intentional, the types of lights that we put in that area so that it kind of felt like bubbles that you might see in a soda. But again, drawing attention, drawing that customer to that branded area. And then the last example we'll run you through is done for a company called Houshens. They have a concept called Crossroads Express. So this store you'll see is kind of different than the other 3 options. So even though it's the same exact type of store, it shops a little different and it looks a little different. So you'll immediately notice things like warmer materials, more muted color palettes. There's not a lot of bold red, or there's not a lot of bold bright greens or blues. And that's done purposely. They wanted it to shop a little bit more like a marketplace rather than a convenience store. So even things like picking materials really do have an impact on how your customer experiences that store. One other thing that we were able to do for them, they had a fresh food offering that they really wanted to drive sales for. So even things like intentionally planning the space in a certain way or designing that department to be very visible was something that was really important to them. So this fresh everyday section is actually a window into the prep space where they're prepping sandwiches and wraps and salads, but allowing your customer to kind of peek behind the scenes, again, reinforces your messaging that your food is made fresh every day. And then I mentioned materials earlier, even bringing in natural materials. So that was one thing we did here in the case of like the stack stone and the warm wood tones that you're seeing. But again, it feels a little bit more like a grocery or a market rather than a C-store. And then their brand personality was slightly different than maybe Good To Go's or Extra Miles, who might have a little more fun with their messaging. So for instance, how you label departments or how you might name some of your branding within the store can also affect kind of how your customers view your brand. So for instance, just specifying this is bottled beer or cold beverages, that's a little different than giving it a fun name, like you saw Extra Mile where they called it Fizz, right, instead of just saying fountain drinks. So all of those decisions play a role in branding and environment. And then lastly, something subtle, again, that I like to point out is their logo had a little bit of curvature in it. So picking that up in some of the forms within the space, like the curved millwork, the curved signage that hangs over the checkout, all those things reinforce that brand to your customer. And then lastly, as Shaun mentioned, we kind of want to switch gears a little bit and then kind of lead into maybe a Q&A. But when we were thinking about, well, how does that approach change when we're talking about specifically tribal-owned C-stores? Or does it change? So I think some of the questions that we would work with you guys if we were to partner with you, or you're partnering with someone like ourselves, would be maybe specific to each store. So I don't think it's as universal as maybe the trivia game was last night. There may not be an exact right answer. Maybe answers are differently depending on your market and what your tribes are doing in your own stores. But some of the questions we would ask is, what challenges are you facing? And how they might differ from other owners' challenges, or maybe they are the same. Do you have certain tasks with logistics that other C-store owners might not face? Maybe it's harder to get product into certain areas. Maybe it's harder to find overhead or employees to work your stores. But also, how might your target audience be different? So like I mentioned, the target audience for the Nemacolin market is very different than the target audience for an Extra Mile store. In their case, they actually were catering towards employees that lived in nearby on-resort housing, as well as guests that might be staying for a weekend at a time. Whereas an Extra Mile shopper is someone that's probably in and out, maybe on a road trip, or a customer that shops there in the morning or at night on their way home from work. So we would get underneath what your target audience is, and that obviously informs branding decisions. And then showcasing tribal values. Is that something you would want to do? Is that something that you would shy away from? So those types of things obviously would play a role into how you might brand your specific environment. And then connection to the community. So whether that's to the tribe itself or the local surrounding area, whatever the case might be, we would ask, questions like what is missing or what is your store not currently providing to those, to that target audience? And then hopefully try to design a store layout or design signage or branding or something that could help you achieve reaching that audience. But that's about all we had planned, so we'll kind of open it up for questions and anything you guys might have. Thank
you. All right. Yeah, thank you. I just want to open up for questions. Oh, I do have a question. Is it ever too late to rebrand? If you've been around for 10 years or longer, is it ever too late?
No. There's never a bad time to rebrand. No, we often see clients that have had stores for 15, 20 plus years that they haven't done a remodel on, and they're really kind of just stuck in, hey, what's next for me? How do I increase my customer's experience? And we can kind of help them navigate, where in that process that we showed should you start? Should you start with a completely new refresh for your brand? Should you completely rename the building? We help with people that haven't touched a building in quite some time. So there's never too late.
Yeah, I'm just looking around the crowd real quick. Hold on, because I don't want to say anything that make someone mad. All right. Just speaking hypothetically, if you were have a major partner with somebody and you want to rebrand and make it your own identity, is that a harder thing to do than starting from scratch of trying to separate that partnership and doing your own brand? If you for instance, Extra Mile and Chevron, You know what I mean? At some point, maybe you just want to be extra mile. How do you break that tie?
Gotcha. Yeah, it's a good question. No, we're seeing a lot of companies moving away from national partnerships and really trying to differentiate their store and tell their own story. So we see that move happening a lot, where people are, even that Rockets example, that's a company that had historically been Speedway, and they wanted to step out of that and create their own Rockets brand. So I think telling that story, if you feel like you have a unique audience, I think that it's easy to tell that story. But at the same time, we can create differentiation within a national brand as well, so that if you're carrying, a national brand mark, you can still have a unique kind of local story to tell. So we can do both ways.
Okay. I just want to know, any questions out there? Oh, one in the back, probably from online. Yep. So what does the rebrand process look like? And can you give a brief explanation from start to finish?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it's hard to answer universally because it might look different for different people depending on where you are in your company's lifeline. If it's an existing brand, obviously we might jump in at certain points. But if you're talking about, hey, I want to create a brand, maybe I'm a store owner, but like Shaun mentioned, I've had a franchise name, but I really want to branch out and create my own brand. I think, like I mentioned on that slide, really you start with defining your audience, doing your homework, doing a discovery, and then you really jump into art direction and branding. So first thing is to figure out your naming, your logo, what color palette you're going to carry, and then obviously your materials and how that translates into your environment. So that's technically a rebrand. And then if you're actually looking to renovate your stores, then we would get into things like the store planning, the interior design with new signage and graphics, and then obviously help you document that so that you have those parts for future growth if you have store number 2 and number 3 and number 4.
And I would say, I think a key takeaway, if you're starting a new rebrand project, is get your team together early. A lot of times we'll have somebody that comes to us with the architectural work has already been done, the site has been planned, now make my brand in the store. And I think when you bring an architect and a general contractor in with an interior or branding team like us, if we can collaborate on the front end and think about where's the entrance going to be, how are we going to have that drive-through situated so that we can be as creative as possible in terms of developing that interior design in conjunction with the architect, I think that you get a better product at the end of the day. And in terms of timeline, we can do very rapid projects, but I think to do a really good job, you're going to want to allow a few months for that design development to happen prior to construction starting, so that everything can be figured out ahead of time, and then the execution is very efficient and cost effective.
Got a question over here.
Yeah, the question was, do we work with Jacksons? We work with Jacksons and the Extra Mile for Jacksons.
I think maybe I just started noticing because of being in the business for the last few years. When did they start doing that and why?
When did they start doing what?
The reimage?
Always their C-store called the Jackson or an extra mile. Those came on how long ago?
Yeah, I don't know. So the question is, how long has Jackson's been kind of doing what they're doing with their Jackson's brand? So I think we've been working with them for 7, 8, 9 years on the current prototype. But prior to that, I think they were still called Jacksons. But the current model that we helped develop with them that launched in Nampa is about 7 years old, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? Oh.
What's the turnaround time as far as rebranding?
Yeah, so the question is, what's the turnaround time for a rebrand? We've seen projects that aren't doing any major construction, so you aren't doing new tile or moving around refrigeration. All you're doing is coming in and maybe changing the paint, doing a light rebrand, and we can typically see those from start to finish in 3 to 4, maybe 5 months. As soon as you start getting into any major construction, your timeline goes out because you have to consider permitting. If anybody's tried buying any refrigeration over the last couple of years, you know that those lead times have gone way out. So really, that's where you start getting into 6 months, a year, 18 months for some of those major reconstruction projects.
Yeah, I was just curious, do you guys have sales data? How do you measure success of a rebrand project?
We do. Sorry, the question is, do we have any sales lift data for remodels? We do. We have a lot of feedback from our customers. I hesitate to say too much because it really depends on a lot. It depends on the market in which you're operating. It depends on, are you trying to coincide with a larger marketing campaign? Are you trying to rebrand just to keep up with new competition that's coming into the market and maybe stealing some of your customers or some of their sales? But typically, any investment in a store, even if it's just cleaning up the bathroom and improving the lighting, that is going to have an impact on your sales. What we encourage you to do is be really intentional and think about, hey, if I'm going to spend a certain amount of money on a remodel or a rebrand, let's spend it the right way. I've been in some convenience stores where all the money went into the bathrooms. It's the most beautiful bathroom with expensive finishes, and it's if that's your story, great, that's your story. But it's also better to partner with a group that can really help you prioritize where to spend your money so that you can spend the same amount and get more return on that spend. But in terms of numbers, we've seen sustained sales lift of 20, 25, 30% post-remodel. If you're in a more competitive landscape, you might see something closer to 10 or 15.
We've never seen a negative or a decline after a rebrand, though. Never. Not once.
Nice. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, we appreciate you speaking today. I think I was actually very impressed with the images of your conceptuals to actual implementation. They looked really good and spot on, so it looked real nice. I appreciate it. Thank you. If you guys want to come right down here, we got a gift for you for speaking.
Thanks.